I think most of us were here last week. Although I would ask if you're comfortable, perhaps just Frank, you could just to say a word or two about yourself and where you are in geographically in the world and spiritually. You could just unmute first.
Frank, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you got to go back to the beginning.
I'm in Austin, Texas. I missed last week. I wasn't aware of it. I'm an old friend of Steve Kinney's. I grew up Presbyterian and been involved in the Episcopal Church for a number of years. I'm very dissatisfied with most church services and activities. I actually don't attend regularly church anymore, although I have keen theological interests. And I can't wait to see what we make out of the Gospel of John, which I find very inviting and very puzzling. And I'm kind of drawn to what are nowadays called interspiritual perspectives. I'm inclined to see truth in all the major spiritual traditions. I don't know how to put it together. I'm just looking, searching.
Well, I'll say you always have good questions that help propel our conversations, our discussions forward. So thanks, Frank. And Batya, we haven't seen you for quite a while.
I know, it's been a couple of years.
Good to have you back. Just a few words about yourself, whatever you'd like to
Sure.
share.
My name is Batya Haas. I live in the Philadelphia area, and I've kind of wandered around a lot of different places. I was born and raised Jewish, not religious, but very culturally identified. And I really drew away from that out of lack of interest and connection as early in my adulthood. And I read the New Testament and was drawn to Jesus as a teacher, a wise man. And that led me into Christianity in its, excuse me, in various denominations. In retrospect, I'm not exactly sure what I thought of Jesus, but at the time, I believed enough to become baptized and was always dissatisfied with some of the anti-Semitism I was up against, the contradictions in the Bible, and the fact that I was a Jew who didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. I ended up in Messianic Judaism for a number of years. And at that point, I was able to express the Jewish side of me. My apologies. But I no longer felt that I could accept the dogma, the gospel of Christianity. And I just felt like God was calling me back home. So I went to where my heart was. I went through whatever was required ritually for a Jew to return to Judaism after being in another faith. And I've been just very, very happy where I am now. I'm in a conservative synagogue. I'm very active there. I could, as far as religion is concerned, Judaism doesn't have a lot of dogma. It's a lot of practice and it's a process. But I'm where I feel that God wants me to be.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Rabbi, can I just say something very briefly?
Yeah, please.
Batya, your journey was very, very similar to mine.
Oh, okay. Maybe we should talk sometime. What is it, Richard?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to say the same thing. I'm sorry I did not say this last week when we were talking about ourselves, but I was very active as a Jehovah's Witness for a good part of my life. And and then the same thing happened. And it so happened that the father of my children had passed away, and I met another gentleman who was not Jewish, but was very instrumental in encouraging me to return to my Jewish faith. And I'm so grateful for that. God does work in mysterious ways. And I'm sorry I'm not showing myself today. My family is here visiting, and it's just best that I just speak with you. So thank you for listening.
Absolutely. And we have also a friend, an old friend of mine, one of our oldest friends, Sasha and I, she's here with us auditing today, and that's the S that you see there. She wants to be like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, I think. But I'm sure I'll look over and see if she has any facial expressions, and I'll relay those to you if she's sitting in Sasha's place. Sasha's at work today. Is there anybody else who wasn't with us last week who'd like to say a few words of introduction?
Alan? Alan?
Good morning. My name is Alan Levinson, and I am a participating member with a lot of gratitude and happiness in Or Hamidbar. I am also a Jew who, because my parents did not want anything that reminded them of Europe, they were both refugees, and they raised me non-denominational. I didn't even know I was Jewish until I was 9. And from that point forward until confirmation, when I was 15, I learned a lot about Jewish ideology. Then my life changed, and from college onward, I left Judaism behind me. I came out as a gay man to myself and to my family, and I had to make a very big choice back then, to have my family and friends around me, or to be true to myself authentically as a gay man. The gay side won out, and for the next 50 some odd years, I let my Judaism lie follow. Then I met Rabbi Lazar, and things picked up very quickly. Here was a man I could understand. Here was a man who was speaking as a Jew in the midst of a Bible study group at a local church. He made me feel so comfortable and so much aware of what I had been missing that I quickly started coming to services, and now have spent some very joyful times in Or Hamidbar.
You got your headphones on? Okay. Hey, it's playing out here. Oh, now it's on your headphones.
Sorry,
That's
go
a
ahead.
little bit of my story.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for sharing. Okay. And Stephen, I think you weren't with us last week, were you, Steve Byrne?
Uh,
Steve, are you there?
I am. I'm trying to. Oh. Yes, I'm here. Sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to make my phone work here. I was not with us last week, but I've studied with this group for, I guess, 2 years now. I'm a Christian. I came to faith later in life. I met Steve Kinney about, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago. Attended his Bible study on Friday mornings, and then he introduced me to this group, and it's just been very enriching and joyful to be a part and share in the study. So thoroughly enjoyed that.
Oh, great. Thank you. Anybody else that we missed?
Excuse me, Rabbi Lazar, I'm going to have to leave the meeting, unfortunately. I may be back today. If not, I will catch you next week, God willing.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye. Okay, what I'd like to do today is actually read through the prologue again because I want to relate it to other biblical passages, which we didn't really get to last week. We did an introduction. Steve walked us through at least, part of the way of understanding, framing the gospel according to John. And one of the things that one runs into quite a bit is the connection between this prologue and Philo of Alexandria, which is a little poo-pooed by is very much poo-pooed by Bishop no, with an Espam. In his book that is heavily influencing my reading of John. And so I'd like to go to some of that which is not on the page in a moment. But before we do that, if somebody perhaps would take upon themselves to read this through again, because I want it to be fresh in our minds when we go to the passages in Proverbs and in Job, if that's all right. So somebody go ahead and volunteer if you'd like to read it through the whole prologue. No one? Dan, why don't you read for us?
Okay. Wait a second. Oh, I'm alive there. Okay. Okay. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light. He came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known.
Okay. I think it's worthwhile, especially for those of us for whom this text is new, to read this a number of times to let it sink in. I think there's so many things that we have heard about Christianity that seem to come from this, and Steve last week kind of walked us through some of those pathways. Our approach in this particular group, for those that weren't here last week, is, as we have done with Acts as well, and certainly with Isaiah, to try to find where the common ground between Judaism and Christianity lied in the past and where it may still lie today, and also to understand the differences. But to kind of neutralize that idea that used to be so prevalent and today is less so in academia, that there was a break. At some point, there was one moment where Christianity broke away from Judaism, and to understand that it was a long period of time, many decades, perhaps even 200 years, of which there were still many groups that would call themselves absolutely Jewish, and yet they would talk this way. And that's kind of the approach I think that both Steve and I are taking to this text here, that this is very much a Jewish text, aimed towards, as opposed to what was the view even in things that have been written in the last decade, that this is a very anti-Jewish text spoken from the outside. I think that we're looking at it speaking from the inside. But everybody, please feel empowered to have your own position about this. What we did look at last week was the brief uh, excerpt from Genesis, in which we talked a little bit about the fact that God spoke and things came into being. What I didn't emphasize last week is perhaps it is well known, I don't know, but the Hebrew Bible here was bringing in something very, very novel at the time. In ancient Near Eastern literature, you have the histories of the creation of the world are founded in violence, in gods that are tearing each other apart, literally tearing each other apart. And this is what's in the background. And here comes a God who speaks, because that God is alone, that God is one, that God is everything. And the power of speech, which is the genius of the first chapter in Genesis, of which this section in John is what we would call a midrash. I'm certainly taking that position together with Daniel Boyarin, who wrote a beautiful essay that I read. This is distinct, purely distinct. And so this pivotal moment in the development of religions, from what was widespread in the ancient Near East to what we have in Genesis, to creation through speaking, and including creation of humanity in the image of God, and by extension, those that can speak and build words and sentences and literature, comes this other paradigm shift, which is being described here by the author of the Gospel according to John. It's a paradigm shift based on the same narrative. Now, you should know things were like this until now, but now they're different, because now there is a way to see, to feel, to hear God through Jesus, Before we go on to Proverbs, Steve, would you like to say something different or the same, or?
No, that was nice. Thanks, David. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Anybody else with any questions about the connection between Genesis? Yes, Alan.
Forgive me because I wasn't with you last week, but the first sentence in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Can you interpret that a little bit other than just for us to read the words? What concept is that taking on? What is that attempting to really say? That language superseded the divine? I'm not sure what that means.
Great. Excellent question. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today, to try to break that down. One of the terms, the word that's used here in the Greek, you may know, is logos, or as they pronounce it in Hill Country, Texas, logos. And and that has to do with not just the word itself, but very close to Sophia, which is wisdom. We're going to look at that today. What is that exactly, that word? And then the other thing that we'll look at with the help of Philo is that there's a it's not a conundrum, it's a this is a word that it's a obvious, common word that always gets stuck. It's a it's something that's difficult to understand, because on one hand it's saying God is one.
Enigma?
Yeah, it's an enigma. I'm actually thinking of there's another word, but it's all right. But Richard, as usual, you'll help me find that word. On one hand, God is one, God is all, God is everything, and yet there's the Word. So does the Word precede God? Is the Word separate from God, or is the Word part of God? And it's kind of saying, it's getting away with saying both things, that the Word is the same as God, and yet there's a way for us to distinguish between God and the Word. Well, Stephen, would you put it that way? You probably have better words for this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I closed last week with the Irenaeus's image, an early church father who understood this in terms of God with his two arms, the Word, the Logos, and wisdom, Sophia. So they're extensions of God. So it leads to speculation about Trinitarian ideas, but in the beginning was this notion of the connectedness between what God spoke out of God's own being and the wisdom, as we're going to see in Proverbs here shortly, that is just a beautiful parallel and correlation with First John, I think. And I also, for Alan, when God began to create, we didn't look at this last week, and we looked at it. We didn't reread it today, but in the beginning, and so clearly John's community is amplifying that, is riffing on that, and taking it, hopefully, to in light of their relationship, their understanding, their historical view of Jesus of Nazareth, they came to see the embodiment of God's word in that person, who reflected, just like Sophia, the God, the Creator. So I don't know if that helps.
So Alan, if you would help make sure that by the end of the hour, we've answered that question, I think Philo's going to help us quite a bit. But before Philo, and just one comment about Genesis here. You see there's two alternate translations. This is from the New Jewish Publication Society translation, and they want you to know that most translations say, in the beginning, God created. And that is one way of understanding the words Breshit, in the beginning, Bereshit, at the head of whatever was, at the head, God, bara Elohim, Breshit, bara Elohim, created God, or God created. But what was understood, I think, in recent decades is that the syntax is a little bit different, or at least another absolutely valid translation would be when God began to create. And the difference is that when you say in the beginning, it's like there's a beginning and then God comes on the stage. And that's kind of how it's presented in the gospel according to John. And yet another way of understanding this is no. God is out there. There's way beyond what we can even imagine. But when God began, when the God that we're talking about began to create this world that we know, and there's a bit of a difference there. Yeah, interestingly enough, the Talmud has a few excerpts of what they knew as the Septuagint. They call it Targum HaShivim, the translation of the 70s. And in those excerpts in the Talmud, which I knew because I was a yeshiva student, I got to Hebrew University, and the first course I had, the introduction to the Bible, and the world's foremost authority on the Septuagint, Professor Emmanuel Tov, started to talk to us about. And I was in my first weeks of university, I raised my hand. I said, "But don't you think? How can we use the Septuagint to understand what the original text might have been when it was so tendacious?" I didn't know the word at the time, but there was an agenda that it was trying to. He said in very formal Hebrew, and from where does sir, minayin adoni yodea, from where does my sir know anything about the Septuagint? In a very disdainful way. I was a first-year student, with a big yarmulke and a big beard. And I said, well, the Talmud, for instance, gives this example. I gave this example, is that we were taught in the Talmud that the Greek translation here made a distinction so that you wouldn't understand that a God whose name was Breshit, in the beginning, created God. Because if you look at the text, Breshit bara Elohim, Breshit with a capital B, created God. Okay, translations, original text, whatever it is, the understanding here is an ancient understanding, whether it is the original understanding or not, the one that's reflected in John as opposed to and in the others in the excerpt from Genesis. But Alan, since you brought this up, part of the answer to your question will be, I think, in Proverbs. Would you read number 2 for us?
I was created at the beginning of God's course, as the first of the works of old. In the distant past, I was fashioned, at the beginning, at the origin of earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. Before the foundations of the mountains were sunk, before the hills I was born. Earth and fields had not been yet made, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when the heavens were set into place, when the horizon was fixed upon the deep, when the heavens above were made firm and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when the sea assigned was assigned its limits so that waters never transgress God's command. When the foundation of the earth were fixed, I was with God as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before God at times, rejoicing in God's inhabited world, finding delight with mortal.
The speaker here is, I should have introduced the passage. The speaker is Chokhmah, wisdom, Sophia. That's the speaker here. And the fact that this is a long passage, but we absolutely need to know the context, of course, as I just mentioned. It brought me perhaps to an awakened interest in the book of Proverbs, which I haven't looked into for years and have never seriously studied. Perhaps maybe that's what Orami Bar will do after we finish Joshua. I don't know. It's a little bit difficult because there's no stories in it, right? It's only wisdom. But so now that I've given that framework, what do people see in this? What do they hear in this? Is there anything new, anything questionable, surprising?
I can't be the only one with questions here, Rabbi. So somebody else should.
I know
should
Dan has a
ask.
question.
Well, what's surprising? It's the personification of this abstract idea of wisdom.
Yes.
And by the way, it's not just any personification, it's a personification of a woman, or it's a womanification.
Mhm.
And although I sense what you're saying, where do you perceive that to lie with this particular passage? The feminization of the context.
The feminization is a side note here, and that's
Okay.
yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that, but in the Hebrew, it's felt right away. Chokhmah is a feminine noun, and she's called a woman in different places of Proverbs. That's actually a separate thing. But back here, this is, I mean, what wisdom is saying, I was there from the beginning. And although wisdom is translated in Greek as Sophia, is a different word. They're very interrelated, as Steve said beforehand. They're kind of two branches of something which are, the word I was looking for before is, of course, paradox, right? On one hand, are they derivative? Do they derive from God, or are they God? That's not exactly the same thing. Malka, do you have any thoughts or feelings on this?
Well, when you were talking about Bereshit and in the beginning, I thought about Rashi. And he says that, well, Bereshit is a construct. And he says that the reason it's not in the beginning and it's that when God began to create was because the text didn't come to tell us anything about the order of creation, about what came first and what came later. So that's not the idea at all. So we should read it as a construct like it is. And the other, I forgot my second point.
Okay, well, just
Thinking about
speak
when
up
he-
whenever it comes to you.
So I can't think of what.
Okay,
Oh,
other-
I know what it was. I know what it was now. It said that when Sophia or Chokmah was there in the beginning, I thought about in Genesis Bereshit when it says, "Let us make man in our image," and that some people take that to be that Sophia, that wisdom was present with God at creation.
That's great. I love that. The classical rabbinic commentaries, when you get to that section of Genesis, not our topic today, but related because of just what Malka brought up, is that when God says in the plural, let us create humanity in our own image, it's all in the plural. So there are various ways as that's been tackled. You know, you had 19th century commentators that said, maybe even before that, that said it's God speaking in the first person plural, the royal we, except for in that doesn't exist in Semitic languages. That exists in European languages, other languages. Okay. Another explanation is that maybe God is not yet the only God. God is El Elyon, the highest of God, but there's other gods or demigods there. But the classical rabbinic understanding of that and all the midrash is that God consulted the angels, and as if to say, you know, God says, well, what do you think, guys? Do you think we should do this or not? And not because God needed permission of the angels, but because it's a good management technique, right? To ask those under you, you know, what they think of going ahead with some particular plan or program. And so the angels are important here because are angels gods? Not according to classical Judaism. They're derivative of the one God of Adonai. And are they part of it, but are they extension of it? That's also paradoxical from in Jewish belief, and I would imagine in Christian belief as well. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or questions about this particular section?
Just one last thing. It seems that the first paragraph of the prologue that we read earlier is a digest of what we just read from Proverbs.
Yeah, so this is, unfortunately, this is not easy to copy this book because of the binding and because how small this is from the Jewish annotated New Testament, which we've shared with you before. At the end, they have essays, and one of those essays is John's prologue as Midrash, Logos, a Jewish World, by Professor Daniel Boyarin, who's a very, very interesting scholar, sometimes controversial, but really somebody who says new kinds of things and is very much part of this academic world of there was no break from, there was no particular point in time when Christianity turned from Judaism, but there's a long period of this gray area. Yeah, Frank, were you going to say something?
Oh, well, I'm so puzzled by some things. But the prologue, I mean, there's a heavy duty metaphysics there of Jesus being with God before all time and somehow being a person in time. That whole kind of metaphysics is very hard to make sense out of, even if I find some kind of revelation and truth in the words and the life and the actions of Jesus. But I'm just wondering, what effect does Proverbs have on the prologue? What effect does an understanding of wisdom, which is so rich and so interesting, what effect does that have on the perspective of the prologue? Does that make any sense? Somehow it enriches the relative. Yeah, go ahead.
My first reaction to that would be, well, we don't find this in the other Gospels, of course, as well as many other things.
Right.
This is like a new thing. And you ask, from whence does this come, this idea? And what Boyarin is telling us, this is a midrash. Some people thought this was perhaps liturgical. You find in the New Testament commentaries that the beginning of John is a piece of liturgy. Perhaps it was. His stance is that it's a midrash. It's part of a homily that somebody gave. I mean, somebody got up in synagogue, perhaps, this is already speculation, but this would be, got up in synagogue on that first week of reading the Torah anew, whatever the cycle they were using, probably 3.5 years, but somebody and this was their understanding. This is the sermon, so to speak. So the basis for that, the foundation for this text is the earlier text in Proverbs. That's one way of looking at this. It's satisfying to me because I'm always looking for the intertextuality here. But we'll see there's other things going on at the same time. One thing I wrote to myself is there's a Talmudic term which is taken from the laws of divorce, of all things, right? There are a lot of linguistic traits, phrases that turned into something, really serious wisdom phrases in the Jewish tradition in Hebrew that are taken from things that are very specific in the halachic, the Jewish legal tradition. In the Talmud, there's an expression, lakdim trufa lemaka, which is very, very common in modern Hebrew as well, to prepare the cure before the illness. How would you translate it? Yeah, prepare the remedy before the problem. That would be, look ahead, have something ready, all these protocols in place in organizations. And it's used actually, the first time it's used that I know of in general in Jewish literature is about divorce and a get, a ketubah, the marriage contract, which is essentially an insurance policy that if the man sends away the woman, divorces her because it's one-sided Jewish in the ancient tradition, then he has to pay her a certain amount so she doesn't go away empty-handed. And that's how it's used. That's what it felt like here. Felt like in our understanding of Proverbs and in Proverbs understanding, in John's understanding here, something even before the actual bad behavior of human beings came into being, there was already a remedy. In the case of Proverbs, it was wisdom itself. In the case of John, John is saying it's not only wisdom, it's not only the word itself, but the manifestation as we understand it in Jesus Christ and his time here on the earth. Can I get away with saying something like that, Steve?
Yeah, well, and I just think just the resonance between Sophia was before, with God in the beginning, as was the Word, which was God, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then God speaks, much like the prophets speak the Debar, the Word of God, and much like the prophets and the words given at Sinai that became in the tabernacle that were in the Ark of the Covenant and taken with the tabernacle, so that God's word went with God's people wherever they went. And so now what we have here in John, it seems to me, if we're assuming it's a Jewish work, a Jewish Christian piece of scripture or literature, then it's this idea of the personification, not only of it's the personification of word and wisdom in Jesus, and that to me is that why that relates. There's just a lot of resonance for me. I don't know if the community of John was specifically drawing on Proverbs 8, but I assume so.
Now, when you have a rabbinic way of thinking, a Talmudic way of discourse is, you base what you said, whatever it is you said, whether it's in the realm of belief, wisdom on one hand, narrative, or in halakha and Jewish law on the other hand, you've made a conscious choice of choosing one text and not another. And I know that's a little bit problematic because we don't prove things from silence, right, in academia, but still, this is, the author of John, as we're going to see, knows his Hebrew Bible. There will be a lot of places where John will quote directly from Scripture, but also will be influenced by Scripture, and we'll bring those things out as we did in the Acts of the Apostles as well. And as we did in Isaiah, in Second Isaiah, when Second Isaiah is a late work, is referring, we can tell it's built on something in the past. Well, there's always something you don't choose. And what I'd like to just bring up in the next section in number 3 is the pluralism of wisdom literature, right? We shouldn't expect, because it's in Proverbs, that means that all people that were in that wisdom tradition, wherever it came from, originally from Egypt or from Mesopotamia, and was refined or distilled in the Israelite tradition, but that's already done. In the first century, we already have Hebrew Bible wisdom literature. And what wasn't chosen is the following passage. Harold, would you read for us number 3 from Job? This is Job, a complicated book. Once Steve Kinney suggested that we study that, and I put a kibosh on that right away. I'm not wading into that swamp in a good way. It's a good swamp, but it is so complicated in my mind. But it is wisdom literature, and you may know there's Job and his buddies that are out there, and this comes not after Job spoke, but after Elihu. Elihu has a kind of a speech, one of Job's buddies, but the answer is to Job. That's not in the section here, but this is God answering Job. Go ahead, Harold.
Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions, or who measured it with a line? Onto what were its bases sunk? Who set its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the divine beings shouted for joy? Who closed the sea behind doors when it gushed forth out of the womb? When I clothed it in clouds, swaddled it in dense clouds, when I made breakers my limit for it, and set up its bar and doors, and said, you may come so far and no farther. Here your surging waves will stop. Have you ever commanded the day to break, assigned the dawn its place, so that it seizes the corners of the earth and shakes the wicked out of it?
So my intention here in bringing it, I was reminded of this because it's not exactly antithetical to what was beforehand, but still, this is very much a passage which talks about the one and onlyness of God. Yes, God is speaking to Job, who has questions about theodicy, about God justifying God's self. And then God says, who the hell, who are you? Where were you when I was doing all this stuff? But it feels to me this is very much the one and onlyness of God is speaking here. And why I'm bringing this up is because I don't think we should imagine that everybody had this idea that along the word, along with God was the word at the same time. The word had this existence even separate from God, even if it's from the same of God, a personification. So that's kind of why I brought this particular thing. I think it's important for us to always remember there are choices to be made, and there's a wide array of sources of inspirations that any latter commentator, who I'm in the footsteps of Boyarin, I'm proposing is the gospel here, or at least the author of the first part. Getting back to the issue of word and logos and the importance of word is an important verse here that we have here. Bidvar Adonai Shamayim Nasu Uvaruach Piv Kol Tzva'am. By the word, in a beautiful parallelism here, by the word of God the heavens were made, and by the breath of God's mouth all their hosts were made. Of course, that's the power of parallelism. This idea that it's almost to say not only the word itself that you can hear, but even God's breath, right? So on one hand, it's anthropomorphism, which is challenging for some people. On the other hand, it's a way of elevating word to a greater height. And that kind of gives that to me is an introduction to what I think maybe will be the last thing we get today, because I think we did look at Deuteronomy last time. The only reason I brought this passage from Deuteronomy was to show how that word logos and legon, which is the verb connected to it, are so prevalent in a very small verse about God. And Steve brought up some other things as well, speaking between the cherubim. But let's take a look at this text from Philo of Alexandria. And whereas Spong, in his understanding, is not a fan of he does not think, it doesn't seem to me that he thinks there's a direct connection between Philo and the gospel and this prologue, at least. But it's been out there for a long time. People have been talking about this quite a while, and Boyarin brings this back in as well, and he referenced this passage, which I thought perhaps we would take a look at. Anybody like to volunteer to read this?
I'll read it. Just 237, 238, all of it, or?
Yeah, the whole thing. So Philo, just to remind people, from the last part of the 1st century BCE to the mid part of the 1st century CE, living in Alexandria. What we know from Alexandrian Judaism is mostly from Philo, other books as well in the intertestamental literature. The sacred text for Philo is not only it's not the Hebrew Bible, it's the Greek Bible, it's the Septuagint. And I think that's pretty well agreed upon. And yet, interesting enough, I would just say that Philo has had, as far as Judaism in the last 2,000 years is concerned, or a lasting impression that we have in our literature, Philo has had far more an effect on Christianity, I think, than on Judaism. Go ahead.
We find then that stability or fixity or permanent immobility, in virtue of its immutable and unchangeable quality, subsists as an attribute primarily to the existing being, secondly to his word, which he calls his covenant, third to the sage, and fourthly to the man of gradual progress. What then could make the wicked mind, fit subject for every manner of curse, think that he could stand alone when he is carried to and fro as in a flood, and swept down by eddy after eddy of the torrent of which that dead burden of the body is the channel? Wow. For I thought, he says, that I stood on the edge of a river. River, I submit, is here a symbol of speech, since both flow outward and with a swift, strong current, and both are sometimes fruitful in producing inundations, water in one case, words in the other, sometimes unfruitful when they slacken or subside. And both may be beneficial by irrigating one of the fields and the other of the souls of docile hearers. Both at times do harm, the river by flooding the adjoining land, speech by reducing the mental powers of the inattentive to chaos and confusion. In this way, speech is like a river, but it has a twofold nature, better and worse. The better beneficial, the worse necessarily injurious. Moses has provided examples of both, of the plainest kind to those who have a gift of vision. A river, he says, goes out of Eden to water the garden. Thence it separates into four heads. And he gives the name of Eden, which is by interpretation delight, to the wisdom of the existent, because no doubt wisdom is a source of delight to God and God to wisdom. And so in the Psalms, the singer bids us to delight in the Lord. The divine word descends from the fountain of wisdom like a river to lave and water the heaven-sent celestial shoots and plants of virtue-loving souls, which are as a garden. And this holy word is separated into four heads, which means that it is split up into the four virtues, each of which is royal. For separation into heads or rules is not like separation into local regions, but into kingdoms. And when he points to virtues, he means thereby to declare that the sage who possesses them is a king appointed not by men, but by nature, the infallible, the incorrupter, the only free elector. Thus it was said to Abraham by those who saw his worthiness, "Thou art a king from God with us." And thus they laid down the doctrine for the students of philosophy that the sage alone is a ruler and king, and virtue is a rule and a kingship whose authority is final.
Yeah, should I dare ask you what you feel about this passage? There's so much here, of course.
Wow.
We'll send this out, by the way. I'm sorry I didn't have it ready to send out yesterday. In fact,
Yeah. One of the things I remember studying or being told about was the four mode methods of approaches to take to scripture, and this is, the secret meaning. It seems to me, it's reading things in that are not at all plain.
Mystical.
Yeah.
What was your take, David, on that text?
I think I want to think about it some more, but I think this is the godliness of wisdom, the double-edged swordness of being the word, the positive part of it, the negative, this idea that it's living, it's organic, almost like a river, the continual motion of it, and by extension, understanding part of God and God'sness. It's not God, the idol, of course. It's not the idol of Baal, frozen in time with his hand on a lightning rod, as we know from the statues, ancient Canaanite statues. This is a God constantly in motion and constant contact with the world. As Boyarin brings this passage as as relevant background to what is stated here in the prologue to the Gospel according to John, that they're from the same shul, so to speak. They're from the same synagogue, the same school of thought. And to me that softens things in the parts that are difficult for an observant Jew to read in this prologue here. We'll get to the other parts of John about always the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. But the difficult of saying, which kind of feels it's hard for in a traditional Jewish soul to read this text, this eases it a bit. It puts it into a perspective of what was happening 2,000 years ago and 1,900 years ago, and just how Jewish it was. But here's the thing. As I said, Philo has had so little influence on traditional Judaism, not really discovered by Jews until the 19th century, preserved in the church. His writings were preserved in church circles, not in Jewish circles, in mostly not Jewish circles. There's some exceptions in Italy, 17th century or so, I think. But this idea that, look at, Philo wasn't translated to Hebrew until I was in Hebrew University, until the 80s and 90s. His writings only then. Now you had those Loeb Classic Library things that we all use to look up stuff, but the fact that it wasn't translated to Hebrew language, that's meaningful. That's an important kind of a thing. And so that's where I am with this. That's my excitement about this.
David, I have
Please.
Yeah, I have a question. Just a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned double-edged sword. You said, but I'm not sure what it was. Did you mean the word was a double-edged? Okay.
Yeah, language. Language could be so positive and so divine, yet it can be so
okay,
damaging and negative. And I was also just thinking the fact that people like me in this group here, that I don't know when to be quiet and let others speak, this idea of flooding the world with so many words. Yeah.
now is that your take on it, or did the word logos, in whether in the prologue or in Philo or something, did that also have a double-edged sword connotation?
Yes, I think in Philo I saw it here. Sorry you don't have the text in front of you all the time. I apologize, but where he talks about rivers that could flood and both word and reals, they can be beneficial by irrigating. Both times do harm. The river by flooding. You're joining speech by reducing the mental powers of the inattentive to chaos and confusion. Like, shut the hell up, talk, all the words, the blah, blah.
Okay, got it. Okay.
That's how I saw it, yeah.
Reading that, I had just a very personal reaction, which is, I'd like to think the world is that way. I'd like to believe that. It's very dynamic and engaging.
Is there a but?
Nope.
Oh, good.
I just liked it. It enriched the prologue, I guess.
Alan?
I wanted to mention what I gleaned from this is a level of energy that is palpable. I mean, this is not just a word here, a word there that moves along at a certain, this is dynamic language.
That's the word, dynamic.
And the poetry that is inherent in telling this kind of story is something, Rabbi, that you have shown us to look for through the years that you've been teaching these courses, because not only is energy important, but the direction of the flow is just as important. And when we talk about, for me, for example, because I'm very, very new with any of this, the idea that you have language, logos, and wisdom combined together, if it's possible that logos and Sophia could become one word, then the prologue makes much more sense to me. Because where I was confused previously with the use of the word, now I see that as wisdom, and then everything falls into place because wisdom was with God. Wisdom is part of God. God creates all. And that for me is no longer a question when I read something like this. So I thank you for bringing it up and giving us the ability to see Logos in its context and Sophia in its context.
Malka, did you want to say something? Is your hand up? No, guess not. Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I think, is it true that is it acceptable to say that Philo Hellenized Judaism? Is that, or at least he tried to fit it in a Neoplatonic framework?
Yeah,
Which
I
is
don't know.
what then influenced those early Christian, like Origen and the rest, to go down that bunny hole. Seems to me. So I'm just looking for that link that made this gospel feel so Hellenistic to so many
Yeah.
over
And,
the ages.
and in fairness, not everybody accepts that, right? Some people don't see it that as they don't see it as Hellenistic influence. They see it rather as Jewish influence. And so if you kick the can back the other direction, up the road, as far as down the road, and you say, well, the Hellenization process with Philo, I don't know enough about Philo to say that, but my ears prick up because of my background in traditional Judaism before academia is that well, that's outside influence. And my answer to that is the whole thing is outside influence. I mean, what do we have which is not outside influence, whether it's going with something or going against something? That's still influence, right? Whether it's, as I mentioned, depicting God as speaking creation as opposed to fighting with another God and winning, that's under the influence. What is said in our literature or wisdom literature itself, which is totally under the influence of ancient Egyptian and Assyrian or Babylonian wisdom literature. So I don't know, yeah, I mean, but yes, so Philo understands Judaism and the Hebrew Bible in philosophical structures that were already established before. He's utilizing those, but so the rabbis are doing the same thing in a different way, right? There's wonderful literature now in the last few decades about Zoroastrian and Babylonian cultural influences on the Babylonian Talmud. That's stuff that it's relatively new field, right? Things that but you've got to be a student of ancient Persian literature. You got to do the work to do that kind of stuff. Or, okay. I put the text from Philo in the chat box. We'll keep open for just a few minutes so that those that want to click and save, and Madalena will also be putting it in the YouTube recording for next week's email. Steve and I didn't get a chance yet to talk about next week. I'm going to be away next week in a very different time zone, so I'm not sure. I need to check if I'm able to be, or if I'm able to be part of the group next week, and whether Steve wants to go ahead alone or whether we skip next week. We'll let you know as soon as we find out, by Friday, I think, or by tomorrow. So Steve, if you could stay on for a second, we can talk about that.
You bet.
And I didn't say at the beginning, but I say at the end, may this wonderful collection of people, of souls from so many different backgrounds and also so many different foregrounds, things where we are right now, be a beacon and be an example for this very difficult time we're living in, both in the United States and in Europe in this last week, and certainly in Israel and Palestine, the war in Gaza. And may somehow this study turn into a prayer itself.
Amen.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.